She had survived 31 winters in a town that never once looked at her face without flinching. Not her eyes, not her words, just the scar. That pale, ragged line running jaw to chin like the land itself had tried to erase her. Black Hollow had 100 ways to remind a woman she didn't belong, and they'd used every single one on Mara Ellison. But the afternoon a stranger walked through her door without staring, without that half-second hesitation everyone else couldn't hide, something cracked open inside her chest that she had spent years learning to keep sealed. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The cold came early that year. It rolled down from the Bitterroot Range sometime in the second week of November and settled over Black Hollow like a decision that had already been made. Final, heavy, indifferent to the preferences of the people living underneath it. By the time the first real frost hit, ice had crusted the edges of the horse troughs along Main Street, the mud between the wagon ruts had gone hard as iron, and the sky had flattened into that particular shade of gray that the old-timers called the lid. As in, the sky was a lid on a pot, and everything living beneath it was just waiting to be cooked or forgotten. Mara Ellison had been both, at various points in her 31 years. She was awake before the sun that morning, same as most mornings, because the stove in the back room needed feeding before the water barrels froze, and nobody was going to do it for her. She pulled on her wool coat in the dark, fingers already stiff, and crossed the plank floor of Ellison Mercantile with the kind of muscle memory that comes from doing the same thing several hundred times in the same building. Her boots knew every soft board. Her hand found the iron door of the stove without needing light. The fire caught. She fed it 2 logs, then a third, then stood close to it for a moment longer than strictly necessary, palms out, watching the orange glow begin to push against the dark. She was not a woman who wasted time on self-pity before sunrise. She had tried it years ago, and it hadn't amounted to anything useful. What she was, instead, was practical. Relentlessly, sometimes exhaustingly practical. And the practical facts of her life on that November morning were as follows. She had a store to open, a ledger to balance from the previous day's accounts, 2 sacks of flour that needed to be moved from the stockroom before the moisture in the back wall ruined them, and approximately 4 hours of decent light to accomplish all of it before the afternoon customers arrived. She lit the lantern. She put water on for coffee. She got to work. Ellison Mercantile occupied the corner lot at the east end of Main Street, which meant it caught the morning light well and the afternoon wind badly. Her father had built it in 1861, 2 years before she was born, and had spent the next 22 years slowly going broke inside it while somehow maintaining the belief that the next season would be better. When he died, fever, the winter of 1884, he left Mara the building, the debt, and a ledger full of numbers that told a story nobody wanted to read out loud. She'd spent 3 years fixing the numbers, not by doing anything clever or lucky, but by doing everything herself and sleeping less than she should have, and charging fair prices and not extending credit to men she knew wouldn't pay, and making smart decisions about what to stock and what to let go. The store worked now. It wasn't prosperous exactly, but it worked. It covered its costs and fed her and kept the roof patched, which was more than it had done for her father. The town respected the store. That was not the same as respecting the woman who ran it. This distinction had been made clear to Mara in ways both blunt and subtle over the years, and she had cataloged them with the same precision she brought to her inventory lists. There was the way conversations shortened when she approached a group of women outside the church. Not hostility, exactly, but a kind of cautious quieting, like birds going still when something unfamiliar moved through the brush. There was the way the men who came to buy rope or salt or ammunition would look at the shelves or the floor or some middle distance just above her left shoulder, anywhere that let them conduct their transaction without having to settle their eyes on her face for longer than necessary. And then there was the scar. She'd had it since she was 9 years old, a horse kick that had caught her on the left side of her jaw with enough force to fracture the bone and split the skin from chin to just below her ear. The bone had healed crooked, which meant her jaw sat slightly wrong, which meant her face and profile wasn't quite symmetrical in the way people's faces were supposed to be. The scar itself had faded over the years from raw red to a pale ridged line, but it hadn't disappeared, and it wasn't going to. She'd accepted that by the time she was 15. What she hadn't fully accepted, even now, was the way it seemed to exempt people from basic courtesy. As if the fact that she'd been injured meant they didn't have to pretend to see her as a woman anymore. Just a capable unfortunate, someone you could do business with and feel sorry for without actually having to treat her like a person worth knowing. She'd heard every version of it. That Ellison girl would have been something if it weren't for the accident. Spoken by Edna Hargrove at the General Quilting Circle approximately 6 years ago, loud enough to carry through a wall. She runs that store real well, considering. Considering what, Earl Pickett had never finished saying, but Mara had filled in the blank without difficulty. Must be lonely for her. This one came in many voices, many variations, sometimes sympathetic and sometimes not, but always carrying the same embedded message. She was alone because she was flawed, and the flaw was visible on her face, and that was just the sad shape of things. She had stopped expecting people to mean differently. That was different from giving up. She was precise about this distinction, at least inside her own head. Giving up meant sitting down. She hadn't sat down. She'd just stopped carrying the weight of expectation alongside everything else. Quote, the morning passed the way mornings did. She moved the flour sacks. She balanced the ledger. She swept the front step twice because the wind kept bringing the same grit back, which felt like the frontier's idea of a joke. At 9 o'clock, Doris Tamblyn came in for her weekly supply of dried beans and cornmeal and spent 15 minutes telling Mara about her daughter's upcoming wedding with the barely concealed subtext that some women were lucky enough to have such problems. Mara smiled and made appropriate sounds and counted out the beans with care. And when Doris left, she stood in the quiet for a moment with her hands flat on the counter and just breathed. At 11, Pete Garfield came in for tobacco and stayed too long talking about the trail conditions north of the ridge, not because he wanted her opinion, but because she was there and the saloon didn't open until noon. She sold him the tobacco and listened to him talk, and when he finally left, she moved a display of canned goods 3 inches to the left for no reason other than to be doing something with her hands. At noon, 2 children from the schoolhouse ran in on a dare and looked at her face and ran out laughing. She had learned not to react to that one. Reaction only made it worse, gave it weight, gave it significance. She turned back to the ledger and drew a line under the morning's totals and told herself what she always told herself in those moments. It doesn't matter. It doesn't touch anything that matters. She wasn't sure she still believed that. But the saying of it was a habit now, and habits held you upright when conviction failed. The stranger arrived at 2:30. She heard the door, the bell she'd hung above it, brass and slightly off-key, and looked up from the bolt of calico she was refolding, and her first impression was mostly just large. The man who filled the doorway was built on the scale of the mountains he'd apparently come down from, broad across the shoulder, wearing a coat of dark wool and buckskin that looked like it had been repaired more than once in the field. He had a pack on his back that sat heavy, and trail mud caked his boots past the ankle, and he brought the cold in with him the way the cold usually came in, fast, thorough, completely indifferent to who was standing in its way. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a quietness that seemed at odds with his size. He didn't stomp his feet or blow on his hands or announce himself the way a lot of men did when they came in from the trail. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the store, the shelves, the layout, the displays, with the calm, assessing eye of someone who was running an inventory of his own. Then he looked at her, not at her jaw, not at the scar, just at her, eyes up, no hesitation, no flicker of adjustment. "Afternoon," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried, like it had traveled a long way and didn't need to go any faster. "Afternoon," Mara said. "Help you find something?" "Trail supplies." He moved toward the far aisle without waiting, not rudely, just efficiently, like a man who knew what he needed and trusted himself to find it. "Hardtack, salt pork if you got it, dried jerky, some kind of oil for the rifle, if it's available." "All of it," she said, following at a professional distance. "Salt pork's in the back, smoked last month. Jerky's local venison, good quality. Gun oil's on the 3rd shelf, end of this aisle." He stopped in front of the oil without having to look for it. She noted that. Most men spent 3 minutes walking past what they were looking for before asking. "You the owner?" he asked, turning a bottle of gun oil in his hands to check the seal. "I am." He nodded, like this was simply a fact in the world and required no further commentary. Then he said, without looking up from the bottle, "Good stock for a town this size." It was such a neutral thing to say. She'd heard more elaborate compliments than that 100 times, and none of them had meant much. But there was something in the delivery, the flatness of it, the absence of the slightly too enthusiastic praise people often offered her, as if compensating for something else, that made it land differently. "Thanks," she said. "I spend a lot of time on the ordering." "Shows." He moved down the aisle. She followed, pulling items as he named them, stacking them on the counter with practiced speed. He had a list in his head, and he moved through it systematically, not impulsively, and he didn't ask her to verify prices before agreeing to them, which told her either he had experience with frontier store pricing or he didn't intend to argue about it. Either suited her. At the counter, she began totaling his order. He waited with his hands resting on the wood. Big hands, scarred at the knuckles, a faded burn mark across the back of the left one, and didn't fill the silence with noise. Most people filled silence with noise. She had always found the ones who didn't somewhat easier to be around, though she wouldn't have said that to anyone. "You coming through or staying a while?" she asked. It was a standard merchant's question. It told her whether to mention that she expected a new shipment of coffee in 2 weeks. "Through," he said. "Heading back up after I resupply. Got a winter camp set about 14 miles northeast." "That's above the snow line already." "Not quite yet." He looked at her again, and again there was that directness about it, that absence of flinching. "You know the terrain up there?" "Grew up here. My father used to trap that range before his knees gave out." She named him the total. He paid without argument, exact change from a leather pouch that was worn smooth from handling. "You got everything you need for weather? The lid's been down 3 days. It'll break cold when it does." He looked up at her again, not like she'd said something surprising, but like he was recalibrating slightly, like he was paying closer attention than she'd expected. "What do you figure? Another week? 4 days? Maybe 5. She didn't know exactly how she knew this. 31 years of watching the sky from this particular valley, maybe. The way the pressure had felt that morning against her sinuses. Could be less. He considered this. Then he said, "I'll take another pound of salt pork then." She went to the back to get it. When she came back, he was standing where she'd left him, looking at the wall behind the counter where she'd hung a hand-drawn map of the county, the kind she'd made herself because the printed ones were always wrong about 3 different things. His eyes moved across it with the focused interest of someone who actually knew what they were looking at. "This yours?" he asked, nodding at the map. "Mine. The pass elevation's wrong on every other map I've seen. You've got it right." She handed him the salt pork and added it to his total. He paid the difference, and she wrapped his order in oilcloth and tied it with twine, and he picked it up with an ease that confirmed the pack on his back had not been an exaggeration. "Thorncade," he said at the door. He said it like he was offering a piece of information, not like he was introducing himself for a social purpose. "Mara Ellison," she said. He nodded once, opened the door, brought in a blast of cold air, and then was gone with it, back into the gray afternoon, his boots moving without sound across the frost-hard ground. She stood at the counter for a moment after he left, and she wasn't sure why she was standing there instead of going back to the calico she'd been folding. The store was quiet. The fire popped once in the stove. She picked up her folding. Thorncade. She didn't think about him, or rather, she tried not to think about him with the particular focused effort that was, itself, a form of thinking about someone. That evening, cooking her dinner over the small stove in the back room, salt pork and beans, which she ate without ceremony because feeding herself was maintenance and not an event, she noticed that she was reviewing the afternoon's transactions in her head and kept arriving at the same one. The thing was, she couldn't identify what had been so different about the exchange. He hadn't said anything remarkable. He hadn't done anything exceptional. He'd bought supplies and paid his bill and left. He'd been polite without being performatively polite, which she appreciated. He'd made one comment about her stock and one about her map, both of which were accurate observations rather than compliments engineered to make her feel good about herself. He hadn't looked at her scar, not once. Not the first glance when he'd come through the door, not when she'd turned a certain way in the light, which was when most people either pretended not to notice or did notice in a way that their faces betrayed even when they were trying to control it. He just looked at her, and then at whatever was relevant to what he needed, and at her again when she was speaking, the way a person looks at another person when they're listening. She realized, washing her dish, that she couldn't remember the last time someone had done that without also carrying in their eyes some quality of appraisal or pity or cautious management. The way you looked at something fragile that you weren't sure how to handle. He'd looked at her like she was just a person he was doing business with, which she was, which she always had been. And still it sat strange in her chest, that simple, ordinary thing, that small courtesy she hadn't known she was still waiting for someone to offer. She went to bed early, same as always. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind work the eaves of the building, and told herself the feeling in her chest was nothing, just the echo of surprise. You weren't used to something ordinary happening, and so it felt like more than it was. It doesn't touch anything that matters. She said it once, quietly, to the ceiling. She wasn't sure she believed it this time either. Understanding what Thorncade's brief visit meant to Mara Ellison required understanding what Black Hollow had been for her and what she had become inside it. The town had been settled by hard people chasing harder dreams, which was the same story as most frontier towns. But Black Hollow had a particular quality to its hardness, a kind of social rigidity that had calcified early, the way bone calcifies around an old break. There were the families who had been there from the beginning, the Hargroves and the Tamblins and the Pritchards, and then there was everyone else. And the two categories did not mix with any real ease. Her father had been an outsider who'd married a local woman and built a successful enough business to earn a kind of grudging acceptance. And then her mother had died when Mara was 6, and the acceptance had become more grudging still. And then the accident with the horse had happened, and Mara had become something the town couldn't quite categorize. She was an Ellison, which counted for something. She ran the mercantile, which counted for more. But she was also this, the scar, the jaw, the face that men didn't look at the way they looked at other women, and that counted for everything in the places that mattered most to the social life of a small frontier town. She had not been courted, which was the polite way to say she had been overlooked. There had been one man, years ago, Caleb Marsh, who'd worked the assay office and had seemed, for a winter, to genuinely not care about the scar. She'd let herself believe that. She'd been 24 and had not yet learned to be careful with her own hope. In the spring, Caleb had left for Denver without saying goodbye, and she'd heard later that he'd married a woman there, a pretty school teacher's daughter, and she'd sat with that information for a few days, and then she'd folded it into the ledger of things she knew to be true about her life and gotten back to work. After Caleb, she stopped expecting. It was cleaner that way, less expensive in whatever interior currency hope was paid in. She had the store. She had the work. She had the mountains through her window every morning, white and enormous and indifferent to her in a way that felt somehow more honest than the town's pity. She had made herself useful and competent and nearly invisible, which was a strange thing to achieve when your face made you the most visible woman in a room. In the weeks following Thorncade's visit, Mara did not permit herself to expect him back. Travelers came through, restocked, moved on. This was the nature of the trade, and she was clear-eyed about it. The mountains ate people whole sometimes, or sent them south before winter closed in. He'd said he had a winter camp above the snow line, 14 miles northeast, in that terrain, with the weather she'd been watching build. There were 100 things that could have altered his route, his plans, his survival. She did not think about this, or she tried not to. Instead, she watched November deepen. The temperature dropped to single digits twice in the second week. A trapper named Eustace Foley came in with frostbite on 3 fingers, and she treated the fingers with the same deliberate calm she brought to everything, heating water to the right temperature and cleaning the blackened skin while Foley cursed inventively at the ceiling. And when he thanked her afterward, she told him it was common sense and handed him a bottle of liniment and charged him for the supplies. She'd become the de facto medical first responder for the eastern half of the valley, largely because she was there and she had supplies and she didn't panic, and nobody had asked her to be this thing and nobody particularly thanked her for it. It was just another category she occupied, useful, unfortunate. She didn't resent it, exactly. She just noticed it. On a Sunday morning in late November, she sat in the Mercantile's front room with her coffee and watched the street through the window that faced Maine. It was too cold for much traffic, but there was some old Garrett driving his wagon south at the pace he drove everything, which was the pace of a man who'd decided time was no longer his primary concern. The Henderson boys crossing toward the livery with their shoulders hunched. Edna Hargrove in her good coat, which meant she was going visiting and not to church, because church was the plain coat. Nobody looked at Ellison Mercantile. Nobody looked at the window where the woman with the scarred jaw sat with her coffee, watching the world move past. She was part of the town's furniture, necessary, unremarkable, present in the way a water barrel was present. You needed it. You didn't look at it. She finished her coffee. She went back to work. The following Saturday, the bell over the door rang at just after 2 in the afternoon, and when Mara looked up from the account ledger she was trying to reconcile, the first thing she noticed was that the man coming through the door was moving differently than he had the last time. Not the purposeful, economical stride of someone running a supply errand. This was slower, and the stillness that had characterized him before was gone, replaced by something controlled, deliberate, like a man holding himself in a shape by effort. Thorncade crossed the threshold and caught the doorframe with his right hand, and Mara was already coming around the counter before she'd consciously decided to move. "The hell happened to you?" she said. It was not a professional greeting. It was just the thing that came out when she saw the blood on the left side of his coat, dark through the wool, dried but not old, and the pallor in his face under the windburn, the way he was holding his left arm slightly wrong, braced against his body, in the way of someone who'd learned that a certain range of motion cost too much. "Cougar," he said. He said it with the same flat economy he'd brought to everything else, and somehow that understatement was more alarming than if he'd said it with drama. "I can pay for the medical supplies. I just need—" "Sit down," she said. "Front chair. Now." He sat. Not because he was compliant by nature. She'd read that much about him in 5 minutes of interaction 3 weeks ago, but because he'd apparently reached the point where his body was overriding his preferences. She saw it in the way he lowered himself, careful, methodical, the management of pain translated into slow movement. She turned the sign on the door to closed without being asked, and if she thought about why she did that, why she was locking out business in the middle of a Saturday afternoon for a man she'd met once, she didn't think about it long enough to find an answer. She just did it and went to the back room where she kept the medical supplies, and she took stock quickly and brought back what she needed. Thorne had his coat halfway off by the time she returned. He was managing it alone, which was inadvisable given the injury, but she let him finish because telling a man like that to wait for help was going to create an argument she didn't want to have while he was bleeding. When the coat was off, she could see the damage more clearly, and she took one breath through her nose and then went to work. "How long ago?" she asked, reaching for the scissors to cut away the damaged shirt. "Dawn," he said. "Happened at dawn." She looked at him. "That was 7 hours ago, Thorne. Had to get off the mountain first. You walked 14 miles with this?" 14 miles and some," he said, not proud, just factual. She cut the shirt away from the wounds without arguing further, because the argument was already lost. He'd done it, it was done, and what mattered now was what she did next. There were 4 distinct lacerations across his left shoulder and upper chest, the deepest 2 running parallel from the collarbone down toward the armpit. The cougar had caught him from above in the right. She could read it in the direction and depth of the cuts, the way you could read weather in the sky if you paid attention. He'd turned fast and the animal had clipped him, rather than landed full. And that difference was probably why he was sitting in her store instead of being found on a mountainside in spring. "This is going to need stitching," she said. "I know. Some of this is deep. I know that too." She poured water from the kettle she'd had on the stove and set it to the right temperature and began cleaning the wounds. She'd done this before, Foley's fingers last week, a knife wound 3 years back when 2 miners had a disagreement that settled badly, various smaller things over the years that people had brought to her because the nearest actual doctor was a 2-day ride in good weather. She was not squeamish about blood, and she was not squeamish about pain, her own or other people's. Thorne didn't make sound for a long time. She worked through the first wound and into the second, cleaning carefully, and he sat with his hands flat on his knees and breathed slowly through his nose, and she could see the control it required in the set of his jaw and the way his forearms tightened when she went deeper. "You can say something if it helps," she said. "It doesn't help." She believed him. All right. When she threaded the needle and he saw it, he looked at the wall directly ahead of him and set his face into an expression that was simply blank. Not brave, not uncomplaining, just absent. Whatever he did with pain, he went somewhere it wasn't. She stitched the first deep laceration, and he didn't move. She stitched the second, and his right hand pressed flat against his knee, hard enough that she could see the white around his knuckles. "Almost through," she said. "Take your time," he said. "Do it right." She did. When it was done, and she had the wounds bandaged as well as she could manage, field dressed rather than properly treated, but the best she could do in a mercantile back room, she brought him water and made him drink it, and then she made him sit for another 15 minutes because he'd lost more blood than he was acknowledging, and she wanted to see whether he was going to go gray before she let him stand. He didn't go gray. He sat and drank the water and got some color back, and she sat across from him on a barrel and waited, and the silence between them was the same kind it had been during his first visit. Not awkward, not requiring filling. "Thank you," he said after a while. "You'd have been in trouble if that went untreated another day." "I know." "Then why did you wait until you were in town to deal with it?" He looked at her. "Nearest town was here." She thought about that. 14 miles of mountain trail, bleeding, alone, at dawn, managing it until he could reach somewhere with the supplies to address it properly. She thought about the particular quality of decision-making it represented. Not heroism, not stubbornness, just the cold calculation of someone who'd accepted that most problems were his alone to solve. She recognized it. She'd lived some version of it herself for 7 years. "Strength," he said then, out of no particular transition, and she looked up because the word arrived without context. "What?" "Strength is what keeps people alive up there. Not much else." He glanced toward the window, the mountains behind the glass. "Not looks, not luck most of the time, not whatever else people spend their time worrying about down here." He said down here without contempt, just as a geographical distinction. "You know how to clean a wound and stitch a cut and the difference between a wound that'll turn and one that won't. That's not nothing." She looked at him for a moment. "You're talking about me." "I'm talking about survival." He met her eyes. "But yeah." It was so blunt she almost didn't know what to do with it. People didn't usually say things like that directly. Not to her, not in the way that acknowledged what they were saying. They talked around it. They offered the carefully worded version, the one with enough distance built in that nobody had to acknowledge exactly what was being discussed. "People don't usually say that to me," she said. "What do they usually say?" "Something with the word considering in it," she said, as in, "You're capable, considering." His expression didn't change much. She was beginning to understand that it rarely did. But something shifted in the quality of his attention, a slight focusing. "That's a coward's way to talk." "Most people are cowards about some things," Mara said. "This happens to be one of theirs." "And you let them?" The question was simple, not accusing, genuinely asking, with the same directness he'd applied to everything else. She sat with it for a moment, which she didn't usually do. Most questions about her life, about the town, about the way she was treated, she deflected with efficiency. "I don't know what letting implies," she said finally. "It's not like I've been agreeing with them." "But you haven't been disagreeing either." She looked at him. "You don't know what my options are." "No," he said, "I don't." And he left it there, which was the right thing to do, and she registered that he knew it was the right thing. She stood up and began clearing the medical supplies from the table. "You shouldn't ride tonight. Those stitches need to hold for at least a day before you're on rough terrain." "I wasn't planning to." "There's a boarding house 2 streets north. Mrs. Calloway. She's not friendly, but she's clean and the beds are adequate." "All right." She set the used materials aside and looked at him, still sitting in her chair, still pale but steadier, and said, "Can you stand?" "Yes," he said, and stood without assistance, which she'd expected. She walked him to the front of the store and unlocked the door. The afternoon had gotten darker while she'd been working, the light at that flat November angle that aged everything a decade in an hour. He put on his repaired coat. She'd found another in the back, one of her father's, which she'd pulled out without thinking about it, and picked up the pack she'd set by the door. "What do I owe you?" he said. She named him a price that was the materials and nothing for the work, because she wasn't going to charge him for the work. He didn't argue, which told her he understood it for what it was. At the door, he paused. "I'll be back through," he said. "When I'm down from the mountain." She nodded. "I'll be here." He went out into the cold. She watched him cross the street toward the boarding house, moving with the careful management of a man carrying pain he'd decided to keep quiet, and she stood in the doorway longer than the cold warranted. The seed was already there, she supposed. She hadn't planted it. She hadn't planned anything. It had just arrived in the space between one exchange and the next, small and stubborn, the kind of thing that takes root and ground that's been cold and hard for a long time. She went back inside. She turned the sign back to open. She returned to the ledger she'd been reconciling, sat down, and found that she couldn't remember where she'd left off. The winter settled in, and Black Hollow closed around itself the way it always did. The streets emptying early, the light thinning to the gray pencil line of short days, the town turning inward and harder and more itself. Mara ran the store. She balanced her books. She treated Foley's fingers again when they started to look wrong, and she told him he needed to be more careful, and he told her he'd been more careful than this his whole life, and she said that was his problem to solve. She thought about Thorncade maybe once a day. She was careful to keep it at once a day. She thought about what he'd said. Strength is what keeps people alive, and she turned it over, the way you turned over a stone to see what was underneath. Not because it was a revelation, she'd known it in some form for years, had built her whole life on some version of it. But nobody had ever said it to her directly as a compliment, as a recognition, as a plain statement of observed fact. "You know what you're doing. That's not nothing." She thought about how it had felt to hear it, and then she thought about how long it had been since anything had felt like that, and then she stopped thinking about it and went back to work. But the seed was there, stubborn, quiet, already deeper than she'd intended to let it go. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon, the bell above the door rang again, and when she looked up, it was him. He was moving normally this time. That purposeful, unhurried stride, the kind that belonged to a man who'd decided where he was going and didn't see the need to advertise it. He looked better. The pallor was gone, replaced by the weathered color of a man who'd been outside in cold air for 3 weeks. And when he settled his pack by the door and came to the counter, she could see in the way he moved his left arm that it had healed well enough. "You're walking right," she said. "Your stitch work held," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an acknowledgement, which she'd come to understand was his equivalent of one. She nodded. "What do you need?" He told her. She pulled the items. He paid. And then, instead of heading for the door, he paused by the window that faced the mountains and stood there for a moment looking out. "Staying through to the end of winter?" she asked. "Don't know yet," he said. "Depends on the snowpack up top." He turned. "How's the town been?" It was a strange question. She looked at him. "Same as always." "People treating you right?" The directness of it landed like a stone into still water. She felt the ripple but kept her face level. "People treat me the way they always have." "Which isn't what I asked," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "No," she said. "Not always. But that's not news." He nodded, slowly, the way he absorbed most things. Like he was filing it somewhere, not reacting to it, just receiving the information and putting it in its proper place. "I'll come back through," he said, "when I'm down for more supplies." "I'll be here," she said. "Same as the last time." He went to the door, then he stopped and turned back, just slightly, like something had occurred to him. "Mara," he said, the first time he'd used her name since he'd exchanged it at the end of that first visit. "What you did for me with the stitches, most people wouldn't have bothered. Thought you should know that." She didn't have a response immediately, which was unusual for her. She watched him nod once more and walk out into the winter afternoon, and the bell over the door rang behind him, and the store was quiet. She looked down at her hands on the counter. They were completely steady, but something behind her breastbone was not, and hadn't been, she realized, since the moment that bell had rung on a Wednesday afternoon and she'd looked up and found him already looking at her. Not at her jaw, not at the scar, not at the careful competence she'd built around herself like a wall. Just at her. Like she was exactly who she was, and it was sufficient. That was how it started. Not with drama, not with declaration. With a bell above a door, a man who didn't flinch, and a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be simply seen. And in the months ahead, Black Hollow would test both of them in ways they weren't yet ready for. But that afternoon, in the cold mercantile on the corner of Main Street, the first thread had been pulled, and neither of them, if they were honest, was going to let it go. December came to Black Hollow the way it always did, without announcement and without mercy. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there, and the sky pressed down low and gray for days at a time without a break. And the town contracted around its stoves and its grievances and its small social cruelties the way it always did when the cold made movement costly. People got meaner in winter. Not dramatically so, not in ways that produced events worth recording, but in the small, grinding way of people who were tired and cold and stuck with each other. Mara noticed it mostly in the way the store felt. She could read the town's mood in her customers. When things were good, when the weather was manageable and there'd been a successful hunt and the men had enough whiskey, people came in with a looseness about them, an ease. When things were bad, they came in tight, and sometimes that tightness needed somewhere to go. And the place it went was often the woman behind the counter who wasn't going to fight back. She had learned the shape of this over years, and she'd built her responses accordingly. The flat effect, the professional brevity, the way of completing a transaction that left no openings for the conversation to go somewhere worse. She was good at it, too good probably. She'd gotten so efficient at making herself a surface that nothing could adhere to that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be something other than a surface. Thorne came back down from the mountain the second week of December. She heard the bell and looked up, and there he was, moving through the door with the same deliberate quiet, and she felt something in her chest shift. Not dramatically, not like a revelation, just the small interior readjustment of a room that's been cold too long and suddenly has heat in it. She didn't let it show. "How's the shoulder?" she asked. "Stiff in the cold," he said. "Otherwise fine. Your stitching held." "I know. I do good work." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the direction of one. He came to the counter. "I need to restock. Also," he set something on the counter between them, and she looked down at it. A piece of dense, dark fur, carefully folded. Beaver pelt, premium quality, thick winter coat. "Payment," he said, "for what you did in November." She looked at the pelt, then at him. "I already charged you for the supplies." "The supplies, yeah, not the work." "I said the work was—" "Your time has value," he said, not arguing, stating, like it was simply a fact in the world that she'd apparently missed, and he was correcting. "Take it." She looked at the pelt for another moment. It was worth more than what she'd have charged for the suturing, even if she had charged for it. She knew she should argue further. She picked it up instead. "Fine," she said. "Good." He told her what he needed, and she pulled it, same as before, and they worked through the transaction with the same efficiency they'd established over the previous visits. But this time, when the order was wrapped and paid, and there was no remaining business to conduct, he didn't immediately move toward the door. He stood at the counter with his hands resting on the wood, and she stood on the other side of it, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You got a problem with somebody in this town," he said, finally. Not a question. "Who is it?" She stared at him. "I have a problem with half the town. Could you be more specific?" "The one who was out front when I came through. Big man, red beard. Said something as I came up the steps." She didn't have to think long. "Earl Pickett. What'd he say?" "What did he say to you, or what does he usually say?" "Both." She took a breath. "He called me the Scar Woman to his friend, loud enough for me to hear. It's one of his more restrained options." She watched Thorne's face for the reaction. Most people either winced with that particular pain sympathy she'd grown to dislike intensely, or went carefully neutral, which was its own kind of thing. Thorne did neither. Something in his expression simply went still and focused, like a man acquiring a target. "Don't," she said. "Whatever you're thinking, don't." "I'm not thinking anything." "You're thinking something." He looked at her. "He does it regular?" "Regular enough." "And you just take it." "I run a business," she said. "He's a customer occasionally. The frontier is small and I live in it, and I can't afford to make enemies over every—" She stopped. It's complicated. It's not that complicated, Thorne said. His voice was even. Not angry. She was beginning to understand that he didn't go to anger quickly, that he had some long distance between what bothered him and what he showed. But the evenness itself was telling. A man who talks about a woman that way is a man who's never been corrected. And you think you should correct him? I think someone should. That someone being you after 5 combined hours of knowing me. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him weighing this, actually weighing it, not just absorbing the deflection and letting it go, but actually considering what she'd said and examining whether it changed anything for him. Maybe, he said, but it'd still need correcting. She didn't have an answer for that didn't involve either agreeing with him or defending Earl Pickett, and she wasn't going to do either, so she said nothing, and he picked up his supplies. At the door he paused, same as he had before, and she braced for another thing he was about to say directly that she wasn't prepared for. But what he said was, "I'll be down again in 2 weeks. Need to check in with the land office about the Northeast Tract. I'll stop in after." "I'll be here," she said. "I know," he said, and was gone. She stood at the counter for a full minute afterward, and she was not thinking about Earl Pickett. The 2 weeks passed. She thought about the visit. Not the specific content of what had been said, but the quality of it. The way it had felt to have someone respond to the information about Pickett, not with a wince or an uncomfortable subject change, but with the simple, direct assertion that it was wrong and should be addressed. Nobody had ever responded to it that way. Not her friends. She had few enough of those. Not the women who were kind to her. She had some of those too, a handful, women who were decent to her in the way you could be decent to someone without ever fully letting them in. None of them had ever just said, "That's wrong. It should stop." It was so uncomplicated. She kept turning it over, trying to find what was wrong with the simplicity of it, the way you pressed a sore tooth with your tongue to see if it still hurt. Thorne came back in 2 weeks, on a Thursday, later in the afternoon than she'd expected. He came in with the smell of trail cold on him and his cheeks windburned, and a look about him that suggested the land office meeting hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. He didn't say that. He didn't say much of anything beyond what he needed from the store, and she pulled it and they conducted the transaction, and she almost didn't say anything. "Land office give you trouble?" she asked as he was wrapping his coat. He looked at her with a brief measuring quality. "They're contesting the survey on the northeast parcel. Say the boundary markers don't match the original filing." He paused. "It's a common tactic. Someone with money decides they want the land and they find a sympathetic surveyor. Who's pushing on it?" A beat. "Hargrove." She put the ledger down. Harold Hargrove, whose family had been in Black Hollow since before the railroad, and who had more money than anyone needed in a valley this size, and who used both the history and the money to quietly shape how things went in the county. Edna Hargrove's husband. The man whose quilting circle wife had said that Ellison girl would have been something. "Of course it's Hargrove," she said. "You know him. Everybody knows him. He's been the way things go in this valley for 20 years. She crossed her arms. "He wants the Northeast Tract for what? Grazing? Timber. There's a stand of old growth up there worth a lot to the right mill operation." She thought about this. "There's a woman in county records," she said slowly. "Agnes Whitmore. She's been there for 15 years and she knows every survey filing in the territory. If there's an original document that contradicts what Hargrove's surveyor is claiming, she can find it." He was looking at her with that focused, attentive quality again. "You know her. She came through for dry goods twice last spring. We talked." Mara paused. "I could write you a letter of introduction. It might help. She's not always cooperative with strangers." He considered that for a moment, and she could see the slight friction of it, a man accustomed to solving his own problems being offered assistance, and she waited to see which way it landed. "I'd appreciate that," he said. She wrote the letter. It took her 15 minutes, during which he waited with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, and she wrote a direct letter and sealed it and handed it to him, and he folded it into his inside pocket with care. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet. She might still be difficult." "I can handle difficult," he said. "I know," she said, "but difficult women usually respond better to a warm introduction than to a man deciding on his own that he can handle them." He looked at her, and this time she was almost certain there was something close to amusement in it. Not a smile still, but the quality of someone who found something worth finding. That's probably right, he said. He left. She went back to work. The following Saturday, Earl Pickett came in for tobacco. This was not unusual. Pickett came in for tobacco most Saturdays, and most Saturdays it was an uneventful transaction except for the quality of his presence, which she'd learned to manage the way you managed something mildly toxic. Don't touch it more than necessary. Don't let it get near anything you cared about. He was in a worse mood than usual. She could see it in the way he came through the door, that aggressive looseness that meant he'd had a morning drink or two and was looking for somewhere to put what was moving around inside him. "Ellison," he said. Not a greeting, a statement of her presence, like he was acknowledging an obstacle. "Pickett," she said. "The usual?" "Yeah." He leaned on the counter, and she moved to get the tobacco, and she heard him say to the space behind him, not to her, but loud enough, "Place looks like it's going downhill. Used to keep things tidier." The store was immaculate. She'd spent 40 minutes that morning making sure of it. She came back with the tobacco and set it on the counter and named the price. He put the coins down with a slapping motion that was meant to be dismissive. "You're welcome," she said, flat, level. He looked at her then, finally, with the particular quality he reserved for these moments. The look that said he knew exactly where the line was and had decided he was going to walk right up to it. "You know what your problem is, Ellison." "I don't think I asked," she said. "Is that you got no one to tell you when you're falling short." He picked up the tobacco. "A woman in your situation needs to work harder to keep people coming back." She said nothing. She was counting the coins, slowly, deliberately, making him wait. The bell above the door rang. She didn't look up, but she heard the step. That particular step, the one she'd memorized without meaning to, the quiet for its size footfall that belonged to a man who moved with more care than his build suggested. "Afternoon," Thorne said from the doorway. Pickett turned. She finished counting the coins and made a note in the ledger. "Thorne Cade," she said without looking up. "I'll be with you in just a moment." "Take your time," Thorne said. She heard him come into the store, not toward the counter but toward the shelving, and she heard the sound of him moving along the aisle with no particular hurry. Pickett's energy had changed. She could feel it without looking at him. A slight recalibration, the way a man recalculated when another man of uncertain temperament entered his vicinity. "I'll be going," Pickett said. "All right," Mara said. He left. The bell rang. She stood for a moment looking at the coins on the counter, her hand flat on the ledger. "You didn't need me to do that," Thorne said from the aisle. "I know," she said, "but he left." "He would have left anyway. He got what he came for." Thorne came to the counter. He put his hands on the wood and looked at her with a directness she was still not entirely accustomed to receiving. "What do you need?" he said. "From the store?" she asked, because it was easier. "From here. From this situation." He moved a hand slightly, indicating something larger than the building. What would actually help? Nobody had asked her that. She looked at him. She was 46 seconds from saying nothing. "I've got it handled," the answer she gave to every offer of this kind, and she could feel the reflexive shape of it already forming. "I don't know," she said instead, which was the truth, and which surprised her to say. He nodded, like that was a valid answer, like he wasn't going to push past it or fill it with suggestions. "I'll take some flour," he said, "and whatever jerky you've got that's fresh." She went to get it. On the way back, she noticed, not for the first time, but more clearly than before, that having him in the store changed the quality of the air in it. Not in any sentimental way, just that the room felt less empty with him in it, and she'd been so long in a room that felt empty, she'd stopped noticing the emptiness as a condition rather than simply the normal state of things. She came back with the flour and the jerky, and she set them on the counter and didn't say any of what she was thinking, because she was still learning what she was allowed to think. Winter moved. It moved the way winter in mountain country moved, slowly, reluctantly, like a creditor who knew you'd pay eventually and saw no reason to hurry. The snows that came in January were the hard kind, the kind that packed down in layers rather than blowing through, and the road north toward the mountain pass became impassable for 3 weeks straight, which meant Thorne was down from the mountain more than he might otherwise have been. He didn't take a room at Calloway's this time. He made camp on the southeast edge of town, close enough to access the store and the land office, but at a remove from the town's social geometry that she recognized as deliberate. He came into the store 3 times a week, sometimes more, and each visit ran longer than a supply run strictly required. They talked, not about large things, not at first, about the snowpack, about the surveying dispute, about the quality of the winter season and what it meant for the spring trail conditions. She told him things about the valley she'd accumulated over 3 decades of watching it, and he listened the way he did everything, with complete attention, like she was saying something worth holding, and she listened to him. He didn't talk about himself in any organized way. No history volunteered, no backstory offered, but things came out in pieces, the way they do when people spend enough time together that the edges soften. He'd been in the mountains 8 years. Before that, somewhere east. He said this vaguely, the vagueness itself informative. He had no family, he mentioned. He'd built the winter camp himself, over 2 seasons, from materials hauled up on 2 different pack horses. "You ever get lonely up there?" she asked him once, on a Tuesday afternoon when the store was slow and the snow had been coming down for 6 hours, and she'd had time to let the question form all the way. He thought about it. Actually thought, rather than deflecting. "Sometimes," he said, "but lonely up there is different from lonely down here." "How?" "Up there the loneliness is just the shape of the place. It's what it is. Down here." He paused, his hands around a cup of coffee she'd poured without discussing it, the way she'd started doing a few weeks back. "Down here it's something people do to each other. That's harder." She sat with that. "Yeah," she said. "It is." He looked at her over the coffee. "How long have you been doing this alone?" "Running the store? 7 years?" "I mean the rest of it." She looked at him. 31 years, she said, give or take. Something in his face shifted. Not pity, she was alert for that, and would have closed immediately if she'd seen it. Something more like recognition, like he was looking at something he understood from the inside. "You're good at it," he said. "At being alone? At not letting it break you." She looked down at the counter. Outside, the snow had thickened. Nobody was coming in. The fire snapped in the stove. She thought about what he'd said, and she thought about whether it was a compliment or an observation, and she decided it was both, and that the distinction didn't matter as much as the fact that he'd seen it, had looked at her life and named what was true about it without softening it or making it something it wasn't. "I don't know if it hasn't broken me," she said honestly. "I think some things might have broken, and I just didn't notice at the time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's probably true for most people." "Is it true for you?" He looked at the window, at the snow, at the mountains he would go back to when the pass cleared, 14 miles northeast, in the cold and the quiet and the loneliness that was just the shape of the place. "Yeah," he said, "some things." She didn't ask what things. He didn't offer, and the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who'd said something real and were letting it settle before either of them moved. Spring, when it finally came, arrived in the piecemeal, unreliable way of mountain springs. A warm week followed by a late snowstorm, followed by 3 more warm weeks. The landscape going soft and then hard and then soft again. The valley working itself free of winter in increments. The road north opened in late March, and the store got busier with the returning traffic of people coming through who'd been snowed in elsewhere or had been waiting for passable trails to continue their business. Thorne was still in the valley when the road opened. She hadn't expected that. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. That the access would pull him back up into the mountains immediately, back to the camp and the quiet and the shape of the place. Instead, he came in on the first Wednesday of the open road and bought his usual supplies and stayed long enough to drink the coffee she poured and to help her move a delivery of dry goods from the back of a freight wagon into the stockroom without being asked. "You don't have to do that," she said, appearing in the stockroom doorway to find him already stacking 100-pound sacks with the systematic efficiency of a man who'd decided a thing needed doing. "I know," he said, and kept stacking. She stood for a moment watching him. Then she went to the other side of the stack and started moving from that end. They worked in the same silence they'd developed over winter, the silence that had stopped being the absence of sound and started being something with its own quality, a texture, the kind that only develops between people who've spent enough time together to stop performing for each other. She handed him sacks, and he placed them, and they found a rhythm without negotiating it. "Why are you still here?" she asked when they were half done. He looked at her. "You needed the stockroom done." "I meant in the valley." He set down a sack and straightened and looked at her the way he did when he was actually considering something rather than just answering it. "The land office is still working the survey dispute," he said. "I can't file the formal appeal until they complete their reassessment. Agnes Whitmore's letter helped move it along, but it's still moving slow. Hargrove's dragging it out." "Probably." He picked up another sack. "Also," he stopped and set it down again, and she had the distinct sense of a man choosing his words more carefully than he usually needed to. "The winter was better this year, for being down here." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Than usual," he added, and went back to stacking. She turned back to her end of the delivery and did not say anything, and the silence had a different quality now. Warmer, maybe, and a little less comfortable in the way that warmth you weren't expecting was sometimes uncomfortable before it was good. The trouble with Earl Pickett came to a head in the middle of April, on a market day when the store was fuller than usual, and Mara was run off her feet with 3 separate customers who all needed assistance at once. Pickett came in with 2 of his friends, men she knew by sight, Holt, and a man they called Denny. And they had the energy of a group that had been drinking since morning and had decided their afternoon needed entertainment. She'd been serving Agnes Reed at the dry goods counter and seen them come in and had made the quick calculation. Finish with Agnes, get to them before they had time to settle into anything. She was halfway done with Agnes's order when she heard Pickett say to his friends, but at a volume calculated to carry, "See? This is what I told you. Woman runs a business because she's got nothing else going. Nothing else going because, well." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The store had gone quiet in that particular way of spaces where everyone hears something and nobody wants to have heard it. Agnes Reed, who was 62 and had been in this valley since before half the people in it were born, straightened slowly and turned and looked at Earl Pickett with the expression of a woman who had run out of patience for certain things a long time ago. But before Agnes could speak, Thorne came around the end of the far aisle. She didn't know he'd been in the store. She hadn't heard the bell. She'd been too busy. He must have come in during the rush. He was carrying 2 items he'd apparently pulled from the shelves, and he walked to the counter in front of where Pickett and his friends were standing and set the items down. And then he turned and looked at Pickett with an expression that had no heat in it at all. No heat was worse than heat. She knew that. And from the way Pickett's 2 friends shifted, they knew it too. "I think you came in here for something," Thorne said to Pickett. "Why don't you get it and go?" Pickett looked at him. Pickett was not a small man and he wasn't stupid, but he was drunk enough that his risk calculation was running behind. "This isn't your business, Cade." "No," Thorne agreed. "It's hers." He nodded toward Mara, who had stopped moving entirely and was watching this with her hands very still on Agnes Reed's half-wrapped order. "Which means it's her call whether it becomes mine. And since she's working right now, I'm going to make the call for her." He looked back at Pickett with the same level, almost bored expression. "Get what you need and go." The silence in the store lasted about 4 seconds. Then Holt put a hand on Pickett's arm and said something low, and Pickett looked at Thorne for another moment and then looked away, which was a decision that cost him something visible, but that he made anyway. And the 3 of them went to the tobacco shelf and got what they came for and paid at the counter. Mara took their money with hands that were completely steady and left. The bell rang. The store exhaled. Agnes Reed patted Mara's hand once, briskly, and said, "Let me take those, dear. I'll carry them myself." Mara let her and finished wrapping the order, and when the other 2 customers had been served and the store had found its regular rhythm again, she went to where Thorne was still standing at the counter. She looked at him for a moment. "I could have handled that," she said. "I know you could have." "Then why?" "Because you shouldn't have to handle everything alone all the time," he said. Simply. As a plain fact, the way he said everything. "You've been handling everything alone for 31 years. I was right there." She looked at the counter, at her hands, at the ledger line open to that day's transactions. "I'm not used to that," she said quietly. "I know." He picked up the 2 items he'd brought to the counter, which she now saw were a spool of thread and a packet of needles, things he had no particular use for that she could imagine, things he'd picked up to have a reason to be at the counter. "You could get used to it," he said, "if you wanted." She looked up at him. He was looking back at her with that same unhurried, undemanding steadiness, not pressing, not asking for anything in that moment except that she hear what he'd said and decide for herself what to do with it. She reached under the counter for her price card. "That'll be 15 cents for the thread and needles," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and paid it. And that was all, Mum. No declaration, no dramatic moment. But that evening, after she'd locked the front door and tallied the day's receipts and turned down the lamp in the front room, she sat in the back room with the stove burning low and thought about what he'd said, and thought about what it meant that someone had simply been there. Not because she'd asked, not because it was their job or their obligation, just because they were there and they could, and it seemed to them like the right thing to do. She thought about the seed she'd told herself wasn't growing. She thought about the fact that it clearly was. She sat with it, quietly, in the warmth of her own back room, and she didn't try to talk herself out of it this time. She was too tired for that, and too honest. And the stove was burning, and the night outside was cold, and somewhere 14 miles northeast, a man was going to go back to his camp soon, and she was going to have to figure out what she did with the fact that she did not want him to. She didn't tell him she didn't want him to go. That would have required a kind of honesty she wasn't ready to perform out loud. And besides, there was nothing to tell him. He hadn't announced a departure date, hadn't said anything specific about returning to the camp. The land office dispute was still unresolved, which kept him in the valley. She told herself that was the whole of it. She was convincing herself with less success each week. May came in warm, which the old-timers said was a bad sign. Warm springs in the Bitterroot Valley meant something was building in the upper atmosphere, pressure storing itself in the peaks and passes like water behind a dam. The farmers knew it, and the trappers knew it, and Mara knew it because she'd been watching this particular sky for 3 decades, and she recognized the quality of the warmth. Too easy, too generous, the kind of weather that was spending something it would have to take back later. She said as much to Thorne on a Tuesday morning in early May, when he came in for coffee and stayed at the counter while she worked through her morning inventory. He stood at the window that faced the mountains and looked at the sky for a long time without saying anything. "You think it'll be bad?" he asked. "I think it'll be something," she said. "How bad depends on when it breaks and which direction it comes from. If it comes from the northwest, we'll get wind and rain and it'll pass. If it comes from the northeast..." She looked at the window. "The northeast is where the bad ones come from. They bank up against the ridge and they sit." He looked at the mountains. She looked at him looking at them. "Your camp," she said. "You already moved most of your winter stores down?" "Most." He turned from the window. "There's still a season's worth of equipment up there. I wasn't planning to move until summer." "You should move it now." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of anything, but I know what this sky felt like the week before the storm of 79, and it felt like this." The storm of 79 had taken 2 rooftops off Main Street and killed 4 head of cattle and kept the valley buried for 11 days. She'd been 10 years old, and her father had spent 2 weeks afterward repairing the mercantile. "I'm not saying it'll be that bad. I'm saying don't leave anything up there you can't afford to lose." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll go up tomorrow. Be back down before the end of the week." "Good," she said. He went up Thursday morning. She watched the sky the entire time he was gone. The storm held. The warm weather continued into the weekend, into the following week, smooth and deceptively mild, and some part of her began to wonder whether she'd read it wrong. Whether 31 years of watching wasn't enough to override a warm week in May. She sold seed and spring supplies and fabric, and the traffic through the store increased with the season, and Thorne came back down on Sunday with 2 pack horses loaded with equipment from the camp and said the trail up was clear and the snowpack was retreating faster than he'd expected. "Still think it's coming?" he asked, unloading the horses outside the store. "Yes," she said. "When?" She looked up at the sky. "Soon." He accepted this without argument, which she appreciated, because she had no scientific basis for it and wouldn't have been able to defend it to anyone who wanted numbers. It came on a Wednesday night. She heard it before she felt it. A sound in the upper registers, above the normal wind range, a frequency that the building transmitted through its walls before the air outside carried it in any obvious way. She was asleep, or nearly asleep, in the back room, and she sat up in the dark at 11 o'clock at night and listened and knew. She got up and dressed in the dark and lit the lantern and began moving things. She'd done this before, After the storm of 79, after a smaller storm in 83, after a flash flood in the summer of 86 that had taken the lower third of Main Street and deposited it 300 yards east. She knew the vulnerable points in the store, the west-facing windows, where wind pressure built worst, the roof joint above the stockroom, which had been imperfectly repaired after the 79 storm and which she'd never had enough money to fix properly. The front door, which didn't seal as tightly as it should, and which in a serious wind would let the weather come through the gaps around the frame. She was moving flour sacks away from the west wall when she heard the knock at the front door. She went to it with the lantern and opened it, and Thorne was standing on the step with his coat on and his hat pulled low, and behind him the street was already moving. Not violently yet, but with a gathering quality, the air pushing in one direction with a force that had intent in it. "I heard it," he said. "What do you need done?" She looked at him for half a second. Then, "West windows first. Then the stockroom roof joint needs bracing. There's timber in the back. Front door frame needs packing. I've got rags for it. Flour and dry goods away from the west and north walls." "Show me the timber," he said. She showed him. He moved it without discussion, 3 heavy beams that she could have managed alone but not quickly, into position under the weak joint in the stockroom ceiling, and while he worked, she went back to the flour sacks and the dry goods, moving weight in the lantern light with the focused speed of someone who'd calculated exactly how long they had. The wind hit full around midnight. Not the building noise this time, but the real thing, the weight of it against the west wall, and the windows flexed, and she heard somewhere up the street something go over, a barrel or a sign, the hollow bang of an object becoming a projectile. Thorne was back from the stockroom and moving without being directed, reading the store's vulnerabilities the way a man who'd survived 8 mountain winters read terrain, moving toward what needed addressing before she'd said it. "The west window's going to give if the pressure holds," she said. "I know." He was already pulling a board from the timber pile she kept for repairs. "You got nails?" "Drawer under the left counter." He found them. She held the board while he drove the nails, and the wind pushed against the other side of the glass with a steadiness that made the wood between her hands shudder, and they braced it and stepped back, and it held. The storm settled in for the long work of it. For the next 3 hours they moved through the building in the lamplight. She knew every vulnerable spot, and he executed whatever she directed with an efficiency that required minimal instruction. And somewhere in the second hour she stopped directing and they simply moved together, one finding a problem and the other already solving it before the words were finished. The stockroom roof joint groaned twice and held. The west windows held. The front door packed tight, and the wind found no purchase on the gaps. Outside, Main Street was doing worse. She could hear it in the impacts and the sounds of the town taking damage that the building around her was not. And she registered this with a mixture of relief and guilt that she'd felt before in these situations and had never quite resolved. At 2 a.m, the worst of it passed, not ended. The wind was still substantial and the rain was heavy and horizontal, and the street outside was a ruin of mud and debris. But the worst pressure had moved east, the way weather moved in this valley when it wasn't trapped against the northeast ridge. This one had come from the northwest, which meant it was bad, but not the worst. She stood in the middle of the store and listened to the rain on the roof and felt the building around her and made the assessment. It was whole. It would need work in the morning. The west-facing wall would need inspection, and the stockroom roof joint would need proper repair this summer without any more postponing. But it was whole, and the stock was intact, and the work of the last 3 hours had held. She let out a breath that felt like it came from somewhere deeper than her lungs. "Sit down," Thorne said from behind her. She turned. He was leaning against the counter, and in the lamplight he looked like a man who'd been moving heavy weight in a cold building for 3 hours, which was exactly what he was. She realized she probably looked the same way. Her arms ached, and there was a bruise coming up on her left forearm where a beam had caught her wrong, and she was cold through to the layer below her coat. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't say you weren't." He nodded at the chair near the stove. "Sit down anyway." She sat. He went to the stove and got it going. It had gone low during the work, and they sat in the warming store while the rain hammered the roof and the wind moved the street outside, and neither of them said anything for a while. "It held," she said finally. "It held." She looked at her hands. "I wasn't sure it would. The stockroom joint, the bracing was enough. You'll want to fix it properly before next winter." "I know." She'd known for 3 years. I've been putting it off because the cost keeps coming in after other costs, and I keep moving it down the list. I can help with the repair, he said. I worked timber for a winter, years back. It's not a complicated fix with the right materials. She looked at him across the stove. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, as an offer of something practical, without the particular weight of obligation that offers sometimes carried. You've already... She stopped, started again. You didn't have to come tonight. I know. You could have been at Callaway's or at camp. The storm wasn't your problem. He looked at her steadily. No, but you are. The words landed quietly, without drama. He wasn't looking away from her, wasn't qualifying it, wasn't doing the careful backing away that most people did after saying something that direct, as if they needed to immediately create distance from what they'd meant. She held his gaze and felt something in her chest do something complicated that she didn't have a word for, or had a word for and wasn't ready to say. Thorne, you don't have to say anything, he said. I'm not asking you to. I know you're not. That's... She stopped. That's part of the problem. He tilted his head slightly. How is it a problem? Because I'm used to things coming with strings. She looked at the stove. People offering things, and there being a cost attached that gets named later. Your father's store, your father's debt, your body, your face, your worth to someone else's idea of what you should be. She said it without heat, just reporting. You offer things and there's no... I can't find the strings. He was quiet for a moment. There aren't any, he said. That's what I'm saying. I understand it's unfamiliar. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. It's unfamiliar for me too. This isn't something I do regularly. She looked at him. Being up at midnight bracing someone else's stockroom. Caring what happens to someone else's stockroom. He held her gaze. Caring what happens to the person in it. The rain on the roof was loud. The stove was warm. The lamp threw its small circle of yellow light, and outside the world was moving hard, and they were still, the two of them, inside the building they'd spent 3 hours holding together. I don't know what to do with it, she said honestly. I've been managing alone long enough that I don't know how to... She pressed her hands flat on her knees. I've gotten very good at not wanting things. I know, he said. It's a bad habit to break. Most necessary ones are. She looked at him for a long moment. He was watching her with that patient attention that she'd come to understand was not passivity. It was the opposite of passivity. It was the active choice to wait without demanding, to hold space without filling it, to let her find her own way to whatever she was trying to say. I'm exhausted, she said, and she didn't mean tonight, didn't mean the 3 hours of moving heavy things in the cold. She meant the length of it, the years of it, the accumulated weight of holding herself together against a town that had treated her as functional furniture for 3 decades, the specific and grinding tiredness of fighting for a place in a world that would rather you disappeared quietly. He didn't offer a remedy. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He looked at her with the eyes of someone who understood what exhaustion at that level actually felt like, and he said, Yeah, I know. And that somehow was better than a remedy. They sat there for a while longer, until the rain began to ease and the wind dropped to something manageable, and the worst of the night was clearly behind them. She made coffee, the practical action that was always available when nothing else was, and they drank it in the lamp-warm store while the storm moved east toward the ridge, taking its worst intentions with it. Dawn came gray and wet. She went to the west window and looked out at the damage. Main Street had taken a beating. Hargrove's Hardware was missing a section of roof overhang. The sign above the saloon was sideways. 2 of the barrels from the feed store were in the middle of the street, one of them cracked. There was debris scattered the length of town, and the mud had a depth to it that suggested the drainage ditches had failed somewhere upstream. Her store stood. She looked at it from the inside out, and then went to the front door and opened it, and stood in the frame looking up and down the street, and the building behind her was intact. Thorne came to stand beside her. Not close. There was still a careful space between them that they'd maintained over the months, that respectful distance of 2 people who understood they were close to something and were moving with appropriate caution, but close enough that she was aware of him as a solid, present thing in the wet morning air. You're going to have visitors in an hour, he said. Town will be out assessing. I know. Hargrove might use the damage as an opportunity. She'd already thought about this. Hargrove had wanted her corner lot before. She'd heard it third hand, through Agnes Reed, through the loose talk of a small town that couldn't keep its business private. A storm that left her store visibly damaged was exactly the kind of opportunity that men like Hargrove found useful. She'd seen it before. The sympathetic offer, the low valuation, the suggestion that it might be time to let someone with more resources take on the burden. He'd have to get past me, she said. Yes, Thorne said. He would. She looked at him. He was looking at the street, at the damage, with the same assessing quality he'd brought to the first look at her store shelves months ago. Then he turned and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was different from the careful steadiness she'd seen all winter. Something that had moved subtly in the hours of the storm and its aftermath, as if the night had shifted the terrain between them. "Mara," he said. "Yeah, I want to say something. You don't have to respond to it right now, or at all, if you'd rather not." She waited. "I've been in this valley 5 months," he said, "longer than I've stayed anywhere in 8 years. I've had reasons, the survey, the land office, but those aren't the only reasons, and I think you know that." She looked at the street. "I've suspected. I'm not asking you for anything specific." He paused, choosing. "But I want you to know that whatever is ahead of you, the store, the town, whatever Hargrove tries, you don't have to face it the same way you've faced everything else. Alone." She turned and looked at him. Really looked, in the gray early light with the wet street behind him, and the damaged town on every side, and the building she'd been holding together for 7 years at her back. He was not a clean or simple thing. She knew that. He had 8 years of mountains in him, and whatever he'd left behind when he went up into them, and he was closed about some things in ways that would not open easily, and probably some that wouldn't open at all. He was not a remedy. He was not a solution, but he was there. He had been there all night, and in the morning, in the gray light, that meant something she didn't have a precise word for but could feel with an accuracy that scared her a little. "I've been fighting for this place my whole life," she said, and she was surprised to hear how tired her own voice sounded. Not broken. She wasn't broken, but stripped down to something close to the bone. This store, this town, the right to exist in it without people looking at me like I'm something to feel sorry about. She looked at the damaged street. "And I'm tired. I'm really tired. I don't know if I have another 20 years of it in me." "Then stop fighting for it the way you have been," he said. She looked at him sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means there might be other ways to build a life that don't require you to win this specific fight, in this specific place, on their terms." He said it carefully, not pushing, just offering, the way he offered everything. "What would you build if you weren't building against them?" She stared at him. The question dropped into something deep in her chest and kept going, past the layers she'd built over years, past the practical Mara, who knew what the store was worth, and what it cost her, and why she'd kept it, down to something older and quieter that hadn't been consulted in a long time. What would you build if you weren't building against them? She didn't answer right away because the answer was not a thing she'd had ready, because nobody had ever asked her that before, because she'd spent so long fighting for this particular ground that she'd stopped thinking about whether the ground was worth what the fighting cost. "I don't know," she said finally. She said it like it was a discovery. He nodded. Like that was also a valid answer, like he'd plant the question and let it grow at whatever rate it grew. The town began to wake around them. Doors opening down the street, voices, the sound of boots on wet boards, men beginning the work of assessment and cleanup that followed every significant storm. She could see Elmer Watts from the hardware surveying the damage to his overhang, and 2 women from the boarding house standing in their doorway, and further down, Harold Hargrove himself, in his good coat, moving with the unhurried quality of a man who was noting things he would find useful later. He hadn't looked toward her store yet. He would. "I need to get the front cleaned up," she said, "before people come through." "I'll do the debris on the step," Thorne said. "You don't—" "Mara," he said. She stopped. "Let me do the step," he said. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she stepped back from the door and let him through and went inside to begin the morning's work, and listened to the sound of him moving on the step outside, clearing what the storm had brought. And the sound of it was so ordinary and so unfamiliar all at once that she had to stand still for a moment in the middle of her store and just let it be what it was. The sun came up weakly behind the clouds. The town moved around its damage. And Mara Ellison stood in the middle of the store her father had built and understood, for the first time in a long time, that the question wasn't whether she could keep fighting for this place. The question was whether she still needed to. That question stayed with her through the morning while she cleaned and assessed and the first neighbors stopped by to check. Agnes Reed and Doris Tamblin with her daughter, and a few others who came with the genuine goodwill of people who were decent when circumstances required it and complicated when circumstances didn't. She thanked them and showed them the building was intact and saw the surprise on some faces that it had come through so well. And she didn't explain that it had come through so well because she and Thorne had spent 3 hours holding it together in the dark. Thorne himself was visible on and off through the morning, helping Watts with the hardware overhang at the older man's request, helping a family 2 doors down retrieve a section of fencing, the quiet labor of a man who saw what needed doing. She watched him through the window when she could spare the moment, and she thought about what he'd said in the gray dawn, and she thought about the question he'd left inside her. Harold Hargrove came to the store at 10 o'clock. He came alone, which was how he did his serious business. No witnesses to the specifics, just his presence and his reputation and the invisible weight of 20 years of being the way things went in Black Hollow. He was a large man, well-fed, with gray at his temples and the particular confidence of someone who had not heard the word no in a very long time. "Mara," he said, at the door. He'd always used her first name without being invited to. "I'm glad to see the building standing." "Thank you, Harold," she said. She was behind the counter. She'd been behind the counter when he came in, and she stayed there because the counter was her territory, and she'd learned a long time ago not to cede territory to Harold Hargrove, even in small symbolic ways. He looked around the store with an appraising quality he didn't bother to disguise. "Any structural damage?" "None that concerns you," she said. He looked at her with a brief flicker of something, annoyance maybe, or recalibration. "I'm asking as a neighbor." "I know why you're asking." She held his gaze. "The store is fine. The stock is intact. I appreciate your concern." He moved toward the counter with the unhurried ease of a man who intended to get to something and had decided on the indirect route. "I've been thinking," he said, "that this corner lot is really more commercial demand than a single proprietor can sustain in the long term, especially after weather events like last night." "I've sustained it for 7 years," she said. "You have," he agreed, like this was a pleasant observation. "And you've done admirably. But a woman in your position— What position is that, Harold?" He paused. The pause was itself informative. The half-second recalculation of a man who'd expected less resistance and was adjusting. "Alone," he said carefully, "running a significant property alone without— I'm not interested in selling," she said. Clear, level. The word she'd said to him before, twice in the last 3 years. He put both hands on the counter and she held her ground, and they looked at each other across it the way they always did. The particular stalemate of a man who had all the structural power and a woman who had the single power of her own refusal. "After last night," he said, "the town is going to need to think about what structures are sound and what aren't. The county might get involved in assessments." The threat was thin, but it was there. County involvement meant county inspectors, which meant men Hargrove knew, which meant assessments that found problems that required remediation that cost more than a proprietor without resources could manage. She had known this was coming. She had known it for years. What she hadn't known, until this moment, standing in her store in the morning after the storm, was that she was not afraid of it. She looked at Harold Hargrove, and she felt the exhaustion she'd confessed in the dark hours before dawn, and she felt something else alongside it, a clear, cold clarity, the kind that arrived when you stopped being afraid of losing something and started being honest about what it was actually costing you to keep it. "You do what you need to do, Harold," she said. "So will I." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he straightened and put his hands in his pockets and moved toward the door. "Think it over, Mara," he said. "That's all I'm saying." "I will," she said. She watched him go. She stood at the counter after the door closed, and she stood there long enough that the bell's echo had fully died. Then she went to the window and looked out at the street, at the damaged town putting itself back together in the gray May morning, and at Thorncade 2 buildings down helping an elderly man lift a section of fence back into place, working with the careful patience of someone who was not performing helpfulness, but simply being it. She thought about his question. What would you build if you weren't building against them? She thought about the answer she was starting to find, slow and certain, and a little frightening, in the same way that any true thing was frightening when you'd been keeping it at a distance for a long time and finally stopped. She thought about mountains 14 miles northeast, and a camp built by hand over 2 seasons, and the kind of loneliness that was just the shape of a place rather than something people did to each other. She went back to work. But the thought stayed with her, solid as timber, clear as the air, after a storm had passed through and taken everything loose with it. Harold Hargrove moved fast, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was how fast. By Thursday, 3 days after the storm, word had reached her through Agnes Reed that Hargrove had already spoken to 2 members of the County Assessment Board, both of whom owed him favors of the kind that got repaid quietly and without documentation. Agnes delivered this information in her characteristic style, direct, without embellishment, with the slightly grim satisfaction of a woman who had spent 62 years watching the machinery of this valley operate and had long since stopped being surprised by it. "He's moving on 3 properties," Agnes said, sitting across the counter with her hands around a cup of coffee Mara had poured. "Yours, the Watts Hardware, and the old tannery lot. But yours is the one he actually wants. The others are cover." "I know," Mara said. "The assessment is being scheduled for next week, Tuesday, they're saying." "On what grounds?" "Storm damage to structural integrity." Agnes's mouth went flat. "Hargrove's man will find damage, whether it's there or not. That's how it works." Mara looked at the counter, at her ledger, at the store around her that was, by any honest measure, structurally sound. She and Thorne had gone over it inch by inch in the days after the storm, and apart from the stockroom joint that needed proper repair, the building was solid. It had stood since 1861. It had stood through 3 significant storms and a flood, and 24 years of her father's management and 7 years of hers. "What do you recommend?" Mara asked. Agnes considered. "Get a counter-assessment, someone whose name Hargrove can't reach. There's a structural man in Millerton, fellow named Draper, who does honest work. If you get him here before Tuesday, his report carries weight against whatever Hargrove's man produces." "Millerton is 2 days' ride." "Yes, it is," Agnes said. She stood up, finished the coffee, and set the cup on the counter. "I'd start today." She left. Mara stood in the empty store and did the calculation she always did. Money, time, what was available and what wasn't. She could afford Draper's fee. She could not afford the ride to Millerton and back in 2 days without closing the store. And closing the store meant lost revenue at a moment when she needed every dollar she had if she was going to fight an assessment challenge. Thorne came in at noon. She told him what Agnes had said. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting. And when she finished, he said, "I'll go to Millerton." She looked at him. "That's 2 days there and back on hard trail." "I know the trail." "Thorne?" "Mara." He said her name the way he always did when she was about to argue herself into a corner. "You need to stay here and run the store and document everything about this building's condition yourself before Tuesday. I can ride to Millerton. Let me go." She stood with it for a moment. The part of her that had been managing alone for 7 years wanted to find an alternative, some configuration that didn't require her to accept this much help, this directly, for something this significant. The part of her that had been watching this man since November, that had sat with him through a winter and a storm and the gray morning after, knew that the alternative was worse. "He'll want paying," she said. "I'll cover it and you can settle with me after." "I'm not letting you pay for—" "We can argue about it when I get back," he said. "Or you can let it go and I can leave in the next hour and be in Millerton by tomorrow afternoon." She looked at him across the counter. He was watching her with that patient steadiness, not pressing, just present, waiting for her to land where she was going to land. "Fine," she said. "His name is Draper. Tell him Agnes Whitmore sent you. She knows him. It'll open the door faster." He nodded. He was at the door in 30 seconds, and she had a strange, sharp feeling in her chest watching him go that she recognized now for what it was, and no longer tried to name as something else. She spent Thursday afternoon and all of Friday doing what Agnes had suggested, documenting. She went through the building with a lantern and a notepad, noting every joint, every beam, every section of foundation she could access, writing it down in the precise and organized language she brought to her ledger work. She pulled the original construction records her father had kept. They were in a tin box in the back room, dusty but intact, and cross-referenced them against what she was seeing. She wrote 2 pages of notes that would serve as her own counter-record if Tuesday's assessment tried to invent structural failures that didn't exist. She worked until her hand cramped and her eyes ached and the lantern needed refilling, and then she sat down on a barrel in the stockroom and looked at the walls around her and thought about what Thorne had asked her 4 days ago in the gray dawn. What would you build if you weren't building against them? She'd been turning it over all week in the margins of everything else, not yet having an answer that she could articulate clearly, but feeling the shape of one, the way you felt a word on the edge of your tongue before it arrived. She thought about the store, what it had cost, what it cost her still. 7 years of this, of making herself small enough to be tolerated and useful enough to be necessary, and never quite achieving either. And the thing she'd protected at such expense was still, fundamentally, something she'd inherited rather than chosen. Her father's building, her father's debt, her father's place in a town that had never fully opened its arms to either of them. She thought about that for a long time. Then she went back to work. Thorne returned Saturday evening, later than she'd expected, arriving at the store just before she locked up. He came through the door with the road on him, 2 days of hard riding visible in the set of his shoulders and the look of his eyes, and he handed her a sealed letter without preamble. "Draper will be here Monday," he said. "He's coming himself rather than sending a report ahead." Agnes's name carried more weight than I expected. She took the letter. "You rode hard." "Needed to." She looked at him. He was standing with the particular stillness of someone who was very tired and not quite ready to sit down. "Have you eaten?" "Not since this morning." She went to the back room and got what she had: bread, cold salt pork, a jar of the pickled vegetables she put up in the fall, and set it on the counter between them without ceremony, and he sat on the stool she kept behind the counter and ate while she read Draper's letter. It confirmed what Thorne had said. He'd be in Black Hollow by Monday noon, he'd do a full assessment, and his report would be available before Tuesday's county review. She folded the letter. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. Just that, not diminishing it, not deflecting it. Receiving the thanks the way he did most things, straightforwardly. They sat in the quiet of the closed store, the lamp burning low, the street outside empty and dark, and she was aware that this was the shape they'd fallen into over the months. This particular configuration, the two of them in the lamp-warm space when the public part of the day was done, with no agenda and no performance required. She had stopped being unsettled by it somewhere around February. She didn't remember the specific day it had shifted from unfamiliar to something she simply expected, something that had quietly become necessary. "Harold Hargrove came by again yesterday," she said. Thorne looked at her. "What did he say?" "That he was concerned about my situation, that the county assessment might uncover issues that would require significant capital to remediate, that he wanted me to know he was prepared to make a fair offer if I found myself in a difficult position." She said it evenly. He used the word fair 4 times. People who use the word fair 4 times are usually not offering anything fair. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I appreciated his concern." "That's all?" "That's all I said out loud." She looked at the counter. What I was thinking was considerably more specific. He looked at her for a moment, and again there was that almost quality at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't say it because I need him to underestimate me until Draper gets here," she said. "If he thinks I'm rolling over, he doesn't push harder before Monday. If he knows I've got a counter-assessment coming, he might find a way to interfere with it." Thorne was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's good thinking." "I've been managing Harold Hargrove for 7 years," she said. "I know how he moves." He nodded. He finished the food and put his hands flat on the counter, and she noticed, not for the first time, the particular quality of his hands. The scars, the burn mark, the way they sat at rest, heavy and still. She'd stitched the shoulder above those hands 6 months ago in this same building, and the world had been a different shape then. Or maybe it had been the same shape and she had been different inside it. "Mara," he said. "Yeah." He looked at her with a directness that she recognized as the preface to something considered. "If Draper's report holds and the assessment goes your way, what then?" She looked at him. "What do you mean, what then?" "I mean, What do you want? After this is settled, what does the next year look like for you, if you could choose it? She was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, actually sitting with it, because it deserved that. Because nobody asked her what she wanted, and she'd spent years not asking herself, and she was finding the question both easier and harder than it used to be. I don't know if I want to stay, she said. The words arrived before she'd fully decided to say them, but once they were out, she recognized them as true. Not new true, but the kind of true that had been quietly assembling itself for longer than she'd acknowledged. Thorne didn't react with surprise. He just waited. I've been holding on to this place because it was mine, she said. Because my father built it, and I kept it going, and because letting go of it felt like losing, like proving them right. All the people who looked at me and decided I wasn't worth much. She pressed her hands flat on the counter. But keeping it just to prove something to people who were never going to see it anyway, that's not a life, that's a siege. Yeah, Thorne said, quietly. You asked me what I'd build if I wasn't building against them. She looked at him. I've been thinking about that for 4 days. Did you find an answer? She held his gaze. I think so. He waited. Something that's mine because I chose it, she said. Not because I inherited it and refused to surrender it. Not because staying was the only way to keep my dignity. Something I built because I wanted to, in a place where what I build isn't constantly being measured against my face. The store was quiet. The lamp threw its small circle of light. The mountains, she said. It wasn't quite a question. If you wanted, he said. Careful, not pressuring, offering the same way he always offered, completely, without strings, leaving her the full weight of the decision. You said there was room up there. Plenty of room. For a trading post, she said. There's no supply point for trappers in that whole northeast range. Every man working those trails has to come all the way down to Black Hollow or go 3 days east to Garber. A well-stocked post, positioned right, could sustain 2 people and then some. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something that had opened slightly, something warmer than his usual careful steadiness. You've been thinking about logistics, he said. I always think about logistics, she said. It's how I think. I know. He paused. It's a good plan. It's a rough plan. The details would need working. Yes. She looked at him. He looked at her. The silence between them had a different quality than usual. Not the comfortable quiet of 2 people who'd stopped performing for each other, but the charged quality of a moment that was carrying more weight than any single moment should reasonably carry, all the accumulated months of it pressing forward into now. Thorne, she said. Yeah, if I do this, if I go up there. She stopped, started again. I'm not good at this. I want you to know that. I don't have practice at any of this, and I'll probably be difficult and independent past the point of good sense, and I'll keep accounts of everything in my head and argue about decisions and not ask for help when I should. He looked at her for a long moment. I know all that, he said. And? And I'm still right here, he said. She let out a breath. Something in her chest settled, like a weight that had been held awkwardly for a long time finally finding its proper rest. Monday came. Draper arrived on time, a compact, gray-haired man with the methodical manner of someone who'd been doing honest work for long enough that he had no interest in doing it any other way. He spent 4 hours in the building, going through it with a thoroughness that Mara respected, and he asked her questions and read her documentation and looked at the construction records from the tin box with careful attention. His report, which he wrote that evening and provided to her Tuesday morning before the county assessment, found the structure sound. He noted the stockroom joint as a maintenance item requiring attention within the year, which she already knew. He noted the west-facing wall as adequate but aging, which was accurate. He found nothing that constituted a safety hazard and nothing that warranted remediation beyond normal maintenance. The county assessors arrived Tuesday at 9 o'clock. There were 2 of them, men she didn't know, from the county seat, who had the slightly uncomfortable manner of officials who'd been told by someone powerful to find a certain result and were now confronted with documentation that made finding that result difficult. They went through the building. They asked questions. They looked at Draper's report and at their own notes. They left at noon without making any findings. Harold Hargrove did not come by that afternoon. She'd expected him to see which way it had landed, but he didn't. and his absence was as informative as his presence would have been. He'd been counting on Tuesday, and Tuesday hadn't gone his way, and he was recalculating. She was behind the counter at 2 o'clock when the door opened, and it wasn't Hargrove. It was a group of 3, town council members, 2 men and a woman, Elmore Bates and Pete Crandall and Virginia Hargrove, Harold's sister-in-law, who sat on the council and carried the family interest in its deliberations. She'd been expecting something. She hadn't been expecting this particular shape of it. Virginia Hargrove was a careful, well-dressed woman who did nothing without calculation and who had always maintained a surface of civility toward Mara that was more effective than hostility because it was harder to refuse. She came to the counter and put her hands on it and said, "Mara, we're glad the assessment went well." "Thank you," Mara said. "We wanted to speak with you about the store." Virginia looked around the room with an expression of concerned consideration that Mara recognized as prepared. The storm damage, even if not structural, has affected the character of several Main Street properties. The council has been discussing a revitalization initiative. "Virginia," Mara said, flat, level. Virginia stopped. "I know what this is," Mara said. "You can say it directly. A beat." Virginia's prepared expression recalibrated. Elmore Bates looked at the floor. Pete Crandall looked at the shelves. "The council thinks it might be time to consider what this corner lot could do for the whole community," Virginia said, dropping some of the careful phrasing. "In other hands, with more resources behind it." "In Harold's hands," Mara said, "with proper investment." "Harold wants this lot," Mara said. "He's wanted it for 3 years. He tried the survey dispute, and that didn't work. He tried the storm assessment, and that didn't work. Now he's sending the council." She looked at all 3 of them, steady, without heat. "You can tell him the lot isn't for sale, same as I've told him." Elmore Bates shifted. "Mara, be reasonable. A woman alone in a property this size." "I've managed this property alone for 7 years," she said. "I managed it through last week's storm better than half the properties on this street. I have a full assessment report and clean accounts and no debt outstanding." She looked at him. "Give me one reason, Elmore. One specific, factual reason why this property should change hands." He didn't have one. She watched him not have one, and she watched Pete Crandall study the canned goods display with unusual intensity, and she watched Virginia Hargrove's face settle into something that was almost respect. "Think it over," Virginia said. "I have," Mara said. "I've been thinking it over for 7 years. I'm done thinking it over." They left. She stood at the counter for a full minute after the door closed, and she waited for the shaking to start. The adrenaline aftermath of confrontation that she usually felt once the thing was over. It didn't come. What came instead was a quietness, clean and strange, like the air after a storm has passed through and taken everything loose with it. She walked to the window. She looked at Main Street. She looked at the town she'd been fighting to exist in since she was 9 years old, and she thought about what it had cost and what it was worth, and whether those 2 numbers were ever going to come into balance. They weren't. She knew that now. They'd never been in balance, and they weren't going to be, and no assessment report and no refusal and no amount of proving herself against their expectations was going to change the fundamental arithmetic of what this place was and what it thought of her. The bell above the door rang. She turned. Thorne came through the door and looked at her, and something in how she was standing, or what was in her face, made him stop. "How did it go?" he asked. "They came," she said. 3 of them. Council members. And I told them no." She looked at him across the store. "Same as I always tell them." He waited. "It's not enough," she said. "Saying no. I can say no until I'm 80 years old in this building, and they'll keep sending someone to ask, and I'll still be the woman with the scarred jaw who runs the store that everyone respects, and nobody actually sees." She heard herself saying it and recognized in the saying of it that it had been true for a long time, and she'd been refusing to say it out loud because saying it meant she had to do something with it. Thorne crossed the store and stopped on the other side of the counter, and she looked at him, and he said nothing, just waited the way he always waited. "I want to go," she said. "I want to go up there and build the thing I described and stop fighting for ground that was never going to be mine the way it should be." She pressed her hands flat on the counter between them. I want to stop building against them and start building something I actually chose. He looked at her for a long moment. When? He said. Soon, she said, before I talk myself out of it. He nodded once. I'll start making arrangements for the camp. I'll need time to sort the store, find a buyer for the stock, settle what I owe. Take what you need, he said. I'll be here. She looked at him, at the store around them, at 31 years of her life in a building that had given her everything except what she'd needed most. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. She put out her hand across the counter, not a sentimental gesture, just a practical one, the kind you made when a significant decision had been reached and you wanted to mark it as real. He took it, and his hand was warm and steady and real. And they held on for a moment before letting go. She went back to work. There was a great deal of it left to do. 2 weeks turned out to be 3, because the practical business of dismantling a life that had taken 7 years to build was not something that compressed neatly into a deadline she'd set in an emotional moment. She sold the stock first. Not to Hargrove, she was precise about that, deliberate. She sold the dry goods to Elmer Watts, who expanded into them gratefully and paid fair. She sold the hardware inventory to a supply merchant passing through from the east, who had a wagon and cash and no connection to any of the names that had made her life difficult. The furniture went in pieces. The display cases, the countertop, the shelving her father had built, and she'd repaired 3 times. Agnes Reed took the front chair, which had been in the store since before Mara was born, and paid more than it was worth, and Mara let her because Agnes was one of the few people in Black Hollow she'd genuinely miss. The building itself she sold to a young couple from Millerton, the Garvers, Tom and Helena, who'd been looking for a Main Street property and who had none of the history with the lot that made it complicated. Helena Garver was 26 and had a directness about her that Mara recognized and respected. And when Helena walked through the building, assessing it with clear, practical eyes, Mara felt something she hadn't expected. Not grief exactly, but a kind of clean release. The building would be used. It would be a store again, probably, or something useful. And the walls her father had built would stand for someone who needed them. She signed the papers on a Thursday. The price was fair, not what Hargrove had offered, which had never been fair regardless of the word he'd attached to it, but what the building was actually worth to people who intended to use it honestly. She folded the bank draft and put it in the inside pocket of her coat and stood outside the mercantile for a moment on the step she'd swept 1,000 times, looking up at the sign above the door that said Ellison Mercantile in the paint her father had applied, and she'd touched up twice. She didn't feel the things she'd expected to feel. She'd prepared for grief, had been bracing for it the way you braced for weather you could see building. What she felt instead was quieter than that, a tiredness settling out, like silt dropping out of moving water when it finally finds still ground. She went inside and got her bag. She'd packed with the same precision she'd brought to everything, what was practical, what was irreplaceable, what she could carry without help and without regret. 2 changes of clothes, both worn and both warm. Her father's field compass, which had been on the shelf in the back room for so long it had left a ring in the wood. Her ledger books, not all of them, just the last 2 years because the earlier ones were history, and history didn't require a physical copy when you'd lived it. A small tin box of medical supplies, because some things you carried regardless of where you were going. She left the rest. The curtains her mother had made, which she'd kept for 31 years out of an obligation she couldn't quite name, and which she finally decided she was releasing. The collection of maps on the back wall, except for the county map she'd drawn herself, which she rolled and tied and tucked into the bag, because it was still more accurate than anything the county had officially produced. The chair she'd sat in at the end of every working day. She walked out of Ellison Mercantile for the last time on a Thursday morning in the last week of May, carrying a bag that weighed less than she'd expected, and she pulled the door shut behind her and did not look at the sign. Thorne was waiting at the east end of Main Street with 2 horses, his own and a second one he'd acquired and outfitted for her. Not a borrowed animal, but a solid bay mare with good mountain legs and an even temperament. He'd been arranging things on the trail end while she'd been arranging things on the town end, and when she came down the street with her bag, he took it from her without comment and secured it to the pack frame without needing to be shown how. She stood for a moment looking back down Main Street. It was a Thursday morning and the town was going about its business. Watts at his hardware, the Tamblyn girl crossing toward the schoolhouse. Two men she didn't know loading a wagon outside the saloon. The town would continue. It had continued before her, and it would continue after her, and it would not notice her absence the way she might once have hoped or feared it would. That was fine. She'd stopped needing it to notice a while ago. Earl Pickett was sitting outside the saloon on a barrel with a cup of something, and he watched her come down the street with the look of a man deciding whether to say something. She watched him make the decision and reverse it when he registered Thorne standing at the east end with the horses. She walked past without slowing. Pickett said nothing. The barrel creaked when he shifted his weight. Agnes Reed was standing outside her house 2 doors from the end of Main Street, and when Mara came abreast of her, Agnes put out one hand and Mara took it briefly, and Agnes said, "Right when you're settled." "I will," Mara said, and meant it. "Don't let the mountains make you stupid," Agnes said. "They do that to some people. They get up there and they stop thinking practically." "That's not a risk I'm in any danger of," Mara said. Agnes looked at her for a moment with the clear-eyed appraisal of someone who had known her a long time and didn't need to make the moment bigger than it was. "No," she said. "I don't suppose it is." She let go of Mara's hand and went back inside. Mara walked to the east end of Main Street and took the reins of the bay mare from Thorne and stood checking the girth and the pack frame with the automatic care of someone making sure a thing was done right before committing to it. The horse stood patient and solid under her hands. "Ready?" Thorne said. She looked up at the mountains. The Bitterroot Range in late May was a different thing than the November rain she'd watched through the store window for 31 winters. The snow had retreated to the high peaks, and the lower slopes were the deep, particular green of mountain spring. And the sky above the ridge was the kind of blue that only existed at that altitude and at that time of year, clean and hard and without any of the gray softness of the valley below. "Yes," she said. They rode. The trail north out of Black Hollow was a road for the first 3 miles, then a track, then a path that required attention and preference. She'd ridden parts of it with her father as a child, back when his knees still allowed it, and the terrain came back to her in fragments. The creek crossing at the 4-mile mark where the bank was deceptive, and you had to take it at an angle, the ridge line that looked like the high point but wasn't, the section of loose shale that the horses needed to pick through slowly. She remembered more of it than she'd thought she would. Thorne rode ahead where the trail was single file, and beside her where it widened, and they didn't talk much in the first hours, which suited her. She needed the riding to be what it was, the physical fact of moving through a landscape that was not the town, the feeling of the horse under her and the air at a different temperature than valley air, and the sound of the world changing as the elevation climbed. They stopped at noon at the creek crossing to water the horses and eat something cold from the packs, sitting on a flat rock above the water with their boots near the edge. "How's the mare?" Thorne asked. "Good. She's sure-footed." Mara looked at the creek. The water was high with snowmelt, running fast and clear and cold over the rocks. "I haven't ridden this trail in maybe 20 years. It's changed some in 8 years since I first came up." "How?" Blowdown from the 83 storm took out a section of the upper trail. I routed around it. "The new line's better, actually, less exposed on the northwest face." She nodded, filing it. "How much further to the camp?" 4 hours from here. The last hour is the hardest." She looked up at the peaks. "Tell me about the site." He did. Not in the romanticized way people described wilderness to those who'd never been in it, but in the specific, practical language of someone who'd lived in a place and knew its actual character. The camp sat at roughly 7,000 feet on a south-facing bench above a small lake. The southern exposure mattered because it meant sun until late afternoon, even in winter, and it mattered for any structure they built. There was good timber within half a mile, standing dead that was already seasoned and could be cut without the weight. The water source was a spring, not the lake, which ran clean year-round and didn't freeze at the surface because it came up at a temperature that resisted it. "The bench is larger than you'd think from below," he said. "There's a natural clearing on the east end that's maybe 2 acres of flat ground. That's where the camp is now. The existing structures." "What structures?" "A cabin. Solid, though it needs work on the east wall where the chinking's gone. A storage shed, smaller. I built a lean-to for the horses 2 years ago that's done well." He paused. "It's not much." "I'm not looking for much," she said. "I'm looking for a start." He looked at her briefly. "That's what it is. They rode on. The trail climbed steadily after the creek and the landscape shifted with the altitude. The pine giving way to fir and then to the sparser growth of the high country, the air thinning in ways she felt in her lungs and in the particular clarity it gave to things. The way distant objects that would have been soft in the valley air came in sharp and defined up here, edges clean. The last hour was what he'd said it was. The trail switched back 3 times on a face that required focus, and the horses worked hard and she worked with the mare, keeping her moving without rushing her, finding the pace that was sustainable and sticking to it. She was breathing harder than she'd expected by the time the trail leveled and opened onto the bench. She pulled up and looked. The bench was what he had described, south-facing, wide, the late afternoon sun still reaching it and warming the clearing in a way that felt generous at this altitude. The lake below was a flat oval of blue-gray, catching the sky. The cabin sat at the west end of the clearing, built from the dark timber of the range, lower and more solid-looking than she'd pictured, with a stone chimney that had been constructed with care. The storage shed behind it. The horse lean-to to the north, well positioned out of the prevailing wind. It was not beautiful in the way that landscapes were beautiful when you were looking at them from outside. It was functional and hard and real, and the work of making it livable was visible in every part of it, and it was exactly what he'd said, a start. "The east wall," she said, nodding at the cabin, "needs new chinking on that corner. 2 days' work, maybe 3. I can do that." She looked at the clearing, at the flat eastern end where there was room to build. A trading post would go there, close enough to the cabin to share a roofline eventually, far enough that it functions as a separate structure. Thorne looked at where she was indicating. "You'd want the door facing south." "Obviously," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. She was learning that expression, the not-quite smile that was, from him, a real response rather than a performance. They made camp that first evening with the practical efficiency of 2 people who'd been working alongside each other long enough to need minimal coordination. She took the east wall assessment while he saw to the horses, and she confirmed his description. The chinking had failed along a section about 6 feet long, which meant winter was getting into the wall and would eventually get into the structure. She could fix it. She'd repaired the mercantile walls twice in 7 years, and this was not meaningfully different, just colder doing it. Inside, the cabin was spare but not uncomfortable. A single room with a sleeping platform at the north end, a stove that looked like it had been cast sometime in the previous decade and that he'd maintained well, a table and 2 chairs shelving along the south wall. It was the home of a person who'd been living alone in it and had furnished it for function without any particular attention to the second chair, which was there more out of foresight than expectation. She stood in the middle of it and looked around. "The shelving needs to be doubled," she said, "for stock. If we're running a trading post, we need storage that's accessible without going into the shed every time. I can add a second run along the east wall, and the table's too small for doing accounts at the end of a workday. I'll need something wider." "There's timber." "I know there's timber." She looked at him. He was watching her move through the space with the focused attention he brought to everything, tracking her assessment. "I'm going to be like this," she said. "About the practical things. I'm going to have opinions." "I know," he said. "It might be aggravating." "Probably," he said. "So will some of my habits." She looked at him. "Such as?" "I make decisions without consulting anyone, because I've been the only one here. I'll have to relearn that." He said it without defensiveness, just a plain acknowledgement. "It'll take time." "Fair enough," she said. And that was the whole of it. The honest accounting of 2 imperfect people standing in a small cabin at 7,000 feet in the Bitterroot Range, doing the arithmetic of building something together without pretending the arithmetic was going to be easy. The first month was harder than she'd anticipated and easier than she'd feared, which was probably the honest description of most things that mattered. The east wall took 3 days, not 2, because when she got into the chinking, she found a section of the underlying timber that had taken moisture and needed addressing before it was sealed. She addressed it. Thorne built the additional shelving while she worked the wall, and they moved around the cabin and the clearing in the overlapping way of people learning each other's working rhythms, when to be in the same space and when to get out of the other person's way, when a problem needed 2 sets of hands and when it needed one person to step back and let the other think. They argued twice in the first month. Once about the placement of the trading post door, which she wanted further east than he'd suggested, and they stood in the clearing in an early June rain, going back and forth about sightlines and prevailing wind and the angle of winter sun, until she produced three specific reasons, and he conceded the point with the same directness he brought to everything, which she appreciated because it meant the argument was actually about the door and not about who won. The second argument was about a decision he'd made about the timber cutting without telling her, and that one took longer to resolve because it was about the pattern rather than the specific thing, and they had to talk through what consultation was going to mean when both of them were accustomed to making their own calls. They got through it, not cleanly. There was a day of silence in the middle of it that was uncomfortable, and that neither of them pretended wasn't happening. But they got through it, and what was on the other side of it was a clearer understanding than they'd had before, which was how it worked. The trading post framing went up in the second week of June. Thorne and Mara and a trapper named Ike Story, who came through the bench on his way to the upper range, and who stayed 3 days to help with the heavy work in exchange for a meal and supplies at a fair price. Ike was the first customer, technically, though the post wasn't finished. He bought salt and powder and hardtack, and she wrote the transaction in her new ledger with the same precision she'd brought to the old one. When he left, heading up the trail with his pack and his dogs, she stood outside the half-frame structure and watched him go, and Thorne came to stand beside her. "First sale," he said. $3.40, she said. "I wrote it down." "Of course you did." She looked at him. He was looking at the trail where Ike had disappeared into the fur, and there was something in his face in that moment that she'd been seeing more of over the weeks. Not the careful steadiness that was his public face, but something underneath it, something that had more warmth in it, the quality of a man who was no longer operating entirely on the defensive. "Thorne," she said. He looked at her. Is this what you wanted?" She hadn't asked it before, had been so occupied with her own reckoning that she'd let herself assume. "When you came down from the mountain last November, before any of this, what were you looking for?" He was quiet for a moment, which she'd learned to read as real consideration rather than evasion. "I don't think I knew," he said. "I'd been up here long enough that I'd stopped thinking in terms of wanting things. You just manage what's in front of you." "And now?" He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she'd seen it, which on him meant it was still fairly contained, but there was something visible underneath the containment, something that had stopped needing to stay hidden. "Now I know what I was looking for," he said. Simply, like a fact in the world. She held his gaze. She thought about November, about the bell above the door, and a man who hadn't flinched, and the first small impossible seed of something she'd talked herself out of believing in before it had even had time to take root. She thought about stitching a wound by lamplight and coffee in a cold store, and 3 hours in the dark holding a building together, and a question that had changed the whole direction of her life. What would you build if you weren't building against them? This. She was building this. "Me too," she said. Summer came to the bench in the way it came to high country. Briefly, intensely, with a generosity that you understood as temporary and therefore paid close attention to. The days were long, and the light was different at altitude, harder and clearer. And the work was physical and constant, and she fell into bed tired every night and woke up before the sun because there was more to do. The trading post was finished by mid-July. Not finished the way a building was finished when you had unlimited resources and unlimited time. Finished the way things got finished in the mountains, which meant functional and solid, and she'd deal with the refinements over the next year. She stocked it with what she'd brought up from Black Hollow and what Thorne had carried on 2 supply runs to Garber, and she wrote the inventory in her ledger and arranged the shelves with the same logic she'd used in the mercantile. And when she stood back and looked at it, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, about a space she was responsible for. Pride. Plain, uncomplicated, not defensive. Pride in something she'd chosen. Word traveled. The way word traveled in the high country, through the network of trappers and hunters and the occasional surveying party, person to person along the trails, picked up and passed along the way. Information moved in places without newspapers or telegraph. By August, they were getting 2 or 3 customers a week, sometimes more. Men coming down from the upper range or passing through on the northeast trail who'd heard there was a supply point on the bench and who arrived with the practical gratitude of people who'd been doing without and were glad for the option. She learned them the way she'd learned her customers in Black Hollow, their patterns, their needs, what they were likely to run short of, and when. She extended credit carefully to the ones she assessed as reliable, and not at all to the ones she didn't. And she was rarely wrong because she'd been reading people across a counter for 7 years and the skill transferred. She kept the ledger with precision, and she argued about prices when the argument was warranted, and she didn't make the mistake of softening her assessments to be liked, because being liked wasn't the point. Being trusted was the point. In this terrain, at this altitude, with these people, trust was the actual currency. Thorne's survey dispute resolved itself in September, anticlimactically. The county assessor's office, perhaps tired of the back and forth that Hargrove's challenge had created without producing a result, issued a final determination that supported the original survey filing. The Northeast Tract was legally Thorne's. He received the letter on one of his supply runs to Garber and brought it up to the bench and read it to her at the table over coffee. "Hargrove won't like that," she said. "No," Thorne said. "He won't." "Will he push further?" "He might try, but there's no legal avenue left, and he knows it." He folded the letter. "There's also not much point. He wanted the timber rights, and we've already cut what we needed from the southwest stand. By the time he could get anyone up here with a mill operation, the valuable timber will be gone." She looked at him. "You planned that." "I thought about it," he said, with the slight quality of someone who was deliberately not claiming more than was accurate. She shook her head, but not with disapproval. "You're better at this than you look." "People underestimate quiet men," he said. "People underestimate a lot of things," she said. She thought about Black Hollow sometimes. Not with longing. She was clear-eyed about that, precise about the distinction between thinking about a place and wanting to be back in it. She thought about it the way you thought about a chapter of your life that had been genuinely difficult and genuinely formative, without either romanticizing the difficulty or denying what it had made of her. It had made her good with accounts. It had made her patient and observant and realistic about people and unsentimental about things that didn't deserve sentimentality. It had made her the specific person who could walk into a mountain trading post on a bench at 7,000 feet and know exactly how to run it, because she'd been learning how to run something like it for 31 years in worse conditions. She did not regret the years there. She just knew they were finished. What she understood now, in the particular way you understood things that you'd had to walk a long distance to learn, was that she had never been the problem. The scar on her jaw had never been the problem. The problem had been a town that measured worth in the wrong units, and the years she'd spent trying to make them measure it differently, and the slow, grinding cost of that project over 3 decades. You couldn't fix other people's calculus. You could only stop submitting to it. The first snow of the season came to the bench in late September, earlier than she'd expected, a light fall that coated the clearing and the roof of the trading post and melted by afternoon, more announcement than event. She stood outside the cabin in the morning and looked at the white ground and breathed the air, which was the particular cold, clean air of the first frost, and she felt the mountains around her, not as threat and not as symbol, just as fact, as the actual terrain she lived in now. And she felt herself inside them without the watchfulness that had been her default orientation for as long as she could remember. She wasn't performing. She wasn't managing. She wasn't building against anything. She was just standing in the first snow of a mountain autumn, and the air was cold, and somewhere behind her in the cabin Thorne was making coffee, and she could smell it from 20 feet away. And the peaks above the bench were white, and the sky above the peaks was the hard, clear blue of high altitude in the last warmth of the year. The cabin door opened behind her, footsteps on the frost-hard ground. Thorne stopped beside her with 2 cups and handed her one, and she took it, and they stood in the cold together looking at the range. "First snow," she said. "Early," he said. "I told you." "You did." He looked at the peaks. "Winter's going to be harder up here than it was in town." "I know." "You ready for it?" She thought about what she'd been through to get to this particular morning, this particular altitude, this particular cup of coffee, in the cold. She thought about 31 winters in a town that had looked at her face and decided she was less than she was. She thought about the 7 years of holding a building together alone, and the night of the storm, and the question that had finally cracked something open that had needed cracking open for a very long time. She was not without fear. She'd be a fool not to have it. The mountain winter at this altitude was real and unforgiving and had killed people with more experience than she had. The trading post was new, and the customer base was small, and there were a dozen ways the next year could go wrong before it went right. Thorne and she were still learning each other in the close quarters of a life built together, and there would be more arguments and more difficult silences and more days when the work was harder than their patience for it. None of that was smooth. None of it was going to be. But she was standing in it by her own choosing, on ground she'd gotten to by her own direction, beside a person who looked at her and saw exactly what was there. Not a capable unfortunate, not a woman to feel sorry about, not a scar and a store and a story that ended in a small town on a corner lot. Just Mara. Just the full, complicated, imperfect, entirely sufficient fact of her. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." They stood in the first snow of the year and drank their coffee, and the mountains held them the way the mountains held everything that was real and durable. Not gently, not easily, but completely. The way belonging actually felt when you'd finally stopped looking for it in places that were never going to give it to you. The cold came in off the peaks, and they stood in it together, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she hadn't known she was allowed to want.